and hello everybody online. My name, as Laura's just mentioned, is Katherine Holden. I am also the moderator of this session on digital identity and financial inclusion at CogX in partnership with techUK. And I have a stellar lineup of panelists who I will shortly ask to introduce themselves. But before we do, just as a bit of background for this session, currently the World Bank estimates that over 1 billion people can't officially prove their identity. And in the UK, almost 17% of people have no passport at all. So during this session, we really want to explore the potential for digital identity to enable greater financial inclusion, particularly amongst vulnerable groups, as well as the barriers that must be addressed to ensure digital identity can work for everyone. So delighted to invite my panelists. I'll let them introduce themselves. Maybe to begin with, Adam.
Hello everyone, my name is Adam Cooper. I'm ex-UK government, spent a lot of time working with them in digital transformation and also heading up a lot of the identity work that's gone on in the past. I now spend most of my time working with the World Bank, working in the developing world, trying to look for ways of introducing identity systems, but also digital transformation. And latterly, due to the COVID crisis, working with vaccine delivery systems as well, all of which touch on empowering individuals through the use of digital technology.
Thank you very much, Adam. Looking forward to the session today. Maybe over to Christine next to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Christine Leong. I lead Decentralized Identity and Biometrics globally for Accenture, and been working across public and private sector, including as the program advisor for the World Economic Forum on Digital Identity. So pleasure to be speaking to you all today.
Excellent, thank you, Christine. And finally, Mathieu.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mathieu Altwegg. I lead innovation design and digital identity for Visa in Europe. And we typically work with our clients and partners to test and learn and develop new solutions to the market. As far as identity is concerned, I sit on the Digital Identity Task Force with UK Finance, as well as the working group on the DOSMP, which is an entity of the Banque de France. And we also have been Visa highly engaged with the FIDO Alliance on the topics around biometric and authentication. And today I'll try to bring a payment and global network perspective on the subject.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Now we're keen to make sure that this session is as interactive as possible. So if you do have any questions and if they are directed to particular speakers, do let me know so on the chat and I'll try and get as many of those answered as possible. And also just to remind you, do join the conversation online on Twitter using the hashtag CogX2021. But to kick things off, maybe Adam, if I could come to you to begin with, how much progress has been made when it comes to using digital ID to improve financial inclusion? And what would you say has been the impact that the pandemic has had on this progress?
Well, the pandemic has had a huge impact. We've seen this certainly in the developing world, but we've seen it here too in the UK and in the US, that during a pandemic, people don't have either the ability to go out and to interact face to face, or they don't want to. And because of that, we've seen this huge uptake. So one of the countries I'm working with at the moment is the Philippines. And we've seen there a massive impact in the use of digital services, not just from financial inclusion point of view, but all aspects of life. And whether that's just getting goods delivered in a simple way to avoid going out, or whether it's receiving assistance from the government. I mean, that's often the case in other countries, is that unconditional cash payments in a crisis are often made. And the old ways of making that cash payment as cash, hand to hand, is not possible in a pandemic. So we've seen many countries developing digital means of actually transferring that money. But of course, that then touches on, well, what do we do about the 1.7 billion people in the world who aren't financially included? I mean, that's a real problem in that, because what we don't want to do by trying to beat the pandemic in a way is create even more exclusion. So we have to look at ways of how do we identify individuals, how do we get them into the system digitally. And that can be at a very low level of trust to start with, to onboard them into that digital ecosystem. Moving on later into sort of greater uses of that digital identity, if you like. So we do have to address the gaps in society. You mentioned in the UK that there's a gap in the crossover. If you look at the crossover between passports and driving licenses, for example, we've got a reasonably high percentage of people who don't have either of those documents. And that's a real problem when we get governments like our own government, the UK government, trying to introduce a new identity scheme to log into government services that explicitly asks for one of those two documents. So there's a lot still to be learned globally on how we deal with this problem. We also need to think about, I mean, I'll just throw some numbers at you just to put this into context a little bit. I mean, yes, there's 1.7 billion people who aren't financially included. There's 1.1 billion, as you said, who have no legal identity at all. But even of those who do have a legal identity, 3.4 billion, I believe it is, of them have no means of actually using that that identity digitally. So if we're looking at digital identity, that's a massive problem on that global scale. So we need to look at ways of including people and bringing them into that digital world if we're going to introduce things to do it to make the difference. So just saying we're going to create an app or some new system and just throw that out there is not going to solve the problem. What it might actually do is just amplify the issues. So we need to be very careful there.
That's a really good point, Adam, and something I'd like to pick up with on a bit more detail to come later on in this discussion. But for now, Christine, what are your thoughts? How much progress has been made in this area?
As Adam said, I agree with what he said in the sense that the pandemic has really accelerated the need for a better digital identity, and the old ways of working, of identity proofing, of associating the identity of me with a document just doesn't work, and ensuring that that document really belongs to me. We now have in many ways gone back many years with having to print out, whether it's our vaccine, our test credentials, but those are not associated necessarily with me. We've seen many of such cases online where people have printed out a bunch of tests, QR codes that are static. And well, how do the person at border control know that's me, or did I just just bought one off the internet? And that aspect of trust is critical if we are to help rebuild some of the capabilities, including financial inclusion, including helping us to get jobs, to recover from the pandemic as we go forward, because that aspect of trust in the digital world is very different to physical. Whilst we're all working remotely and digitally like we are today, how, in terms of getting a job, in terms of getting opening a bank account, being able to get payments, how do I prove that with all this bits of paper, and now even more bits of paper with the pandemic? How do we get away from the bits of paper but not go back 50 years having paper only, and improve on that digital trust and as well as adoption?
Absolutely. And that point you mentioned there about building public trust and confidence, particularly post-pandemic, is absolutely key as well. Mathieu, from your side, what's your perspective on current progress?
Sure. So I'll try to maybe add just a slight different perspective to Adam and Christine, and maybe to give more of a payment and network perspective. If you think about the last, the first 50 years of the Visa network, we've been talking about cards, and we all have been habituated to their physical form factor. But if you think quite fundamentally about what they are a 16-digit credential, actually digital credential, that we have associated one way or another to an individual. And if you think about it quite fundamentally, if you can actually prove by one way or another that these cards belong to you, then we're pretty sure who you are. And so I think that was a formidable base layer to try to drive financial inclusion. But we had to do one thing: we had to flip the network on its head. And to give you a sense of the network, we have 60 million merchants, but we have 3.5 billion credentials, these cards, but they're actually digital credential. And so that's kind of the base. And when I say we need to flip the network on its head, well, historically, we've been using this credential to pay. And when you look at financial inclusion, of course, you need to pay and consume and use financial services to pay for stuff. But one of the more fundamental needs in financial inclusion is actually the capacity to be paid. And Christine, you mentioned it. And so we had to flip the network on its head. And what if we could enable this 3.5 billion credential that are pretty scalable and that we know how to put in the hands of people to actually start to become a recipient for funds? And that's what we've done with Visa Direct. You may have heard about it. But I think that was one example of tremendous progress where we could, with a very simple credential, enable people to start receiving funds. And so we continue to invest in that dimension in order to enable more use cases such as cross-border. And I know we'll talk a little bit about remittances, which is a big deal when it comes to financial inclusion. And so enabling the same types of services to reach beyond the primary use cases. So cross-border is one, bigger payment amount is another one, which are subject to higher regulation and higher fraud. So how can we continue to evolve that to drive financial inclusion? Now, to answer the second part of your question, Katherine, let's talk about what the pandemic has done. And I think Adam and Christine have mentioned some of the points. But just to go back on that, just to see this kind of increased momentum, if you just look at peer-to-peer, which is basically people paying people, the 5 global money network or money transfer operators that we work with, they noted a 500% increase year on year in December 2020 alone. So that's one example on the peer-to-peer side. Another example along the same kind of use case is the government and the work they do around disbursement. And we've done a tremendous amount of work with governments in Europe using such functionalities and capabilities to drive financial inclusion and to answer some of these crises. So I think one thing that we realized and we learned during that crisis is that the need for governments to have financial inclusion ready solution to enable the transfer of money to the people in need. And so we've done work with partners such as CaixaBank in Spain, issuing prepaid cards so that people could buy food at canteen and that have been forced to close, social canteens that were closed, so they could actually get cards to buy food for themselves in the normal network. We've done work in France, similarly with the government, in the government of La Somme in French, to actually disperse funds to the people in need, typically in the regions that have been hard hit by tourism, and they were relying on emergency funds from the government, or in countries like Guatemala, for instance, where we did there was a government family bonus program, and also it's about distributing funds to 2 million households. So it's small amounts, but distributed to the mass. In this case, we were looking at $150 per household to 2 million households across Guatemala. And that's very hard to do at scale. But I think sometimes, and I think Adam, you mentioned it, you don't necessarily need this highest level of trust, but if you do have the rails in this case, and a simple 16-digit credential, there's tremendous things you can do, combining digital identity, a simple digital identity attribute, and the need for financial inclusion.
Thank you, Mathieu, and I really appreciate you bringing in some real life sort of case studies there and examples of what you're doing at Visa. Maybe, Mathieu, just sticking with you for a moment there, and you've alluded to this slightly in your answer to the first question, but from your perspective or from Visa's perspective, what are some of the key barriers that you feel need to be addressed to ensure digital identity can work for everyone?
Sure. So I think it's quite interesting because it's true that digital identity, if you think about its more extended, more advanced form, works a little bit like a network, and a bit similarly to a payment network. And that's also why Visa were quite interested in that space. Because on one side, you have someone who issues a digital identity credential. It can be a government, it can be a bank. It can be in the form of a physical form factor with a documentation. It can be digital, issued from the beginning from the bank or recognized by a third-party party. And then on the other side, you have relying parties, which are entities that consume these attributes in order to deliver the service that they want. So I need to verify that you are who you say you are in order to give you money, or in order to work with you or make business with you, and make sure that you are the right person to avoid fraud and to avoid scams. And so that's quite similar. And then you obviously have two additional layers. You have a scheme layer, which coordinates that, sets the rules, sets the commercial framework, and then a technology layer, which enables this safe data, securely exchange of data between the parties. And so if you reflect about a network, there are typically a couple of things that are barriers to scale that. The first one is standards, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, but standards drive interoperability of digital identity, or it's being used. And it doesn't have to be necessarily cross-border. Cross-border is great, but that's probably a second-generation use case. But the first case is even within a country. And I think that's one topic around digital identity, is that the current space is highly fragmented. You have tons of different solutions, all the way to a full scheme, to sometimes just an ID proofing solution. So standards help drive interoperability, and so you can have more players that can build on top of the network. And that's a bit similar to the payment network, where if you pay with a Visa or a MasterCard, it kind of works, right? Because they are built on similar standards. So the merchant or the relying party doesn't need to invest too much in order to consume these digital identity services. So I think that's going to be critical. And when it comes to standards, it's very much the work of the government, and there is plenty happening in the UK. It's the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport who's driving the UK Digital Identity Framework. In Europe, we've seen recently the announcement by the European Commission. And what's interesting is that in their proposal, there is always that dimension of standards, which they not necessarily define, but they rely on industry bodies, the W3C, for instance, the World Wide Consortium, the OIX, which is the Open Identity Exchange. There are plenty of these bodies that sets standards in terms of level of assurance, in terms of what defines an attribute, etc. So I think that's one thing that's very important. Another dimension is scale and adoption. And I know, Katherine, I think you have a specific question on that. So how do we scale and adopt digital identity? So maybe we'll park this one, but I think that's a key barrier to a successful digital identity scheme. And then something that I think, Adam, you mentioned too is I would say accessibility. So how do you make sure that once you have all of that, which sounds very fancy and very technical and advanced, how do you make sure that this actually caters for not just the more tech savvy and the more connected people, but actually to the greater scheme, to the greater picture, or the greater segment population? And I think we see that currently with what we have, we see that some segments are more at risk of fraud when it comes to digital identity. Fraud has obviously been increasing, unfortunately, and in parallel to an increase of usage and people being more aware of their digital identity through COVID, we also seen fraud increase. But we've seen fraud increase and being more discriminatory towards certain segment of the population, typically the elderly, or typically the people who are less financial savvy or tech savvy. And so I think that's a very important dimension, I would say, of digital identity to work for everyone, is to build this accessibility. And I think accessibility can work with technology. It doesn't mean that because it's online, it cannot be connected to people that are offline. And maybe just a last comment or a last thought, on the retail side, when you look at merchants, they also face this similar problem. They deal with, we talk multi-channel or omni-channel type of strategies, where you have a lot of their business being online and being digitally transformed, but you still have some interaction points in the physical world. One example in the financial inclusion space is a company in France called Nickel. They actually work with MasterCard, but we really like what they do and what they are doing in this space. And they enable you to create an account, which is based on cards, in a kiosk. In any kiosk, they have little stations, and on that little station, you can interact, you can recognize yourself, you can use biometrics, and it's obviously done in a way that's accessible for people, and you don't need to be an engineer or a rocket scientist to actually get started and get a bank account. And they've done a tremendous job targeting unbanked people and enabling them to be connected. And so I think on digital identity, you can learn from that and also think about what would have to be my physical aspect of my solution in order to remain accessible for all.
Excellent, thank you, Mathieu. Maybe Adam, if I could come on to you. Now, I know obviously you've been doing a lot of work and a lot of your focus has been on some of the stuff that's happening in the Philippines. I just wondered, whether, building on that same sort of question, the key barriers. I mean, Mathieu just then mentioned obviously issues around interoperability and standards, scalability, accessibility. Is that sort of what you're seeing in your line of work as well, or are there other kind of major barriers that you're finding?
Well, you need things like standards. I mean, that's a given, really. I mean, I've been involved, many of the things Matthew's just mentioned, I've either been involved in authoring or been members of those groups. So the UK standards, I was heavily involved in the US standards with NIST, the EU Commission, EIDAS regulation. I've been involved in all these groups, and the BSI work as well through ISO. So yeah, I mean, standards are very, very needed. They give you lots of input into what I would call technical trust, which we need in a system like this. But we also need a lot of trust in the processes that go on around identity. So we need to have trust in the way that individuals are, in the first place, identified and verified and issued with a credential. And all these processes, many of which have lots of elements to them that are non-technical, that don't rely on the technology underneath. Those two need standards, but they're also human processes. Yeah. So we have to bear all that in mind. And that's a very important part of how trust, and not enough people talk about trust when we talk about identity systems. It's that trust and how we communicate it from point A to point B that's really important in an identity system. It's all one of the things that a service needs to understand is it really Adam? And how much can I trust that it's Adam? And how does that relate to the transaction I'm then going to complete? Yeah, so that, which implies there's appropriateness involved in all of this as well. So don't ask Adam to do something really hard. In other words, get a very high trust credential if he's doing something that's a very low trust transaction. Yeah, because you're just going to create exclusion. Yeah, so that comes back to the conversation we had earlier. So the appropriateness is very important. Different levels of trust is very important. Appreciating that this is really about people is very important. So we need to have mechanisms for redress for individuals as well, for when things go wrong. How do we protect individuals' data? So privacy, data protection. These are actually many of the things that I focus on and my colleagues focus on when we work with countries like the Philippines, to make sure that they've got the correct laws in place that protect individuals, to protect their rights, their data, their privacy, all these kind of things. Because digital identity will affect that. So we need to be very careful about that. We also need to be very careful about when we start to digitally transform society and services, that actually creates problems further down the line for things like fraud. Because if you take a service that was previously face-to-face, had a lot of back office interaction, took a bit of time to happen, it may, yes, have been a problem because of that, because it took a long time for things to happen, but there were lots of human intervention in that process. You digitize something like that without taking into account the potential for fraud and error, and all of a sudden you create an industrial-sized problem for fraud. So you have to think about all these other things around when you're implementing something like a digital identity system. It's not as simple as, here's a credential, go use it. You have to think about all the unintended consequences. You have to think about the rights of individuals. You have to think about inclusion and accessibility and all these aspects, because what you're actually creating is an enabler. That's what digital identity is. It's an enabler for lots of other things to happen that perhaps couldn't happen before. So I think that's very important. And as I say, one of the things we do when I go to the developing world, to maybe a country like the Philippines or others, is you actually have to look at, well, what is the actual real need for the individuals involved? And you see things like, so quite often I'll go to Manila and you'll see people queuing in the heat of the day with their children to get a piece of paper to prove that they have a birth certificate, for example, or something like that, so that they can then go to another government office to actually complete the transaction they want to do. Yeah, that means they're having to take time off work. they're taking their children with them, they're often queuing in the street. It's not an ideal situation. So these are the things that actually you can change with digital identity and transforming services. So you have to look at the impact and what's the real need, but you also have to look at the fact that those people are actually queuing to get some evidence to prove who they are for something. So you can't just give them a digital identity. You have to create another means of getting them registered, which is why we often lead to looking for uniqueness in societies and building national registers of identity and looking at biometrics to do that, to give you that initial kickstart, if you like, of making sure who is who in a society.
Thank you, Adam. Brilliant response there. And actually, touching on some of the things you've mentioned there, particularly around kind of public trust, maybe Christine, if I could come on to you on that next bit. What steps do you think need to be taken to build a sort of network of acceptance and build public trust in the use of digital identities?
I think the aspects of public trust is needed both domestically and internationally. So governments need to work together to harmonize what it means for lots of governments right now are doing trust frameworks. But what trust framework as a term means for me to each one of us may be very different. And it's quite a hard thing to define, whether it's levels of assurance, what, this level of trust equals something, equals one level, and something else equals something else. I think that aspects of harmonization, coming together to collaborate, is critical across different governments globally, similar to, in many ways, how many years ago, ICAO was formed in terms of how passport can trust, countries can trust passport that are issued in order to enable us to travel. And think of the passport where, even though it was first invented to enable cross-border travel, we use it for many, many things because it is trusted. And in that sense, many other emerging digital identities then need to have that level of trust so that we can use it domestically and internationally, cross sectors. Because right now, really, across borders and across sectors, passports are often the only documents where it is accepted. And the other example, of course, is payment cards. That you can use it across sectors and internationally. So what are some of the similarities around the trust frameworks across payments and across passport that are similar? Is because there are things like standards. There are levels of business and organization collaborations that there's a level of uniform expectations, acceptance, and that everybody can trust that this is a real card, that someone who issued my bank, that issued me with a card, or my government that issued me with my passport or my driving license can be trusted. What are the hallmarks of trust in that given credential that has been issued to me? How do I know the organizations that issued my card, that issued my passport is real? Because as much as that aspects of making sure I'm real, we see so much fraud now that the organizations might not be real. And in an increasingly digital world, that aspect is critically important to ensure that the issuance and the verifiers who are taking my identity to say, give me a mobile phone, or giving me a short-term, giving me a cash transfers, or whatever my services may be. That aspects of trust to know that they are also real and they are not taking my data and running away with it, and it ends up on the dark web. So aspects of trust runs on both sides, the users, the issuers, the verifiers across all aspects. And in order to build and create that trust, I think transparency is critically important. Transparency from an issuer side, that the users know where their data is going, that they can check that they are not being violated, their rights are, there's a mechanisms for redress, that sort of thing, as well as knowing that the verifiers are real and using their data appropriately, not having too much data, the aspects of privacy, value of using that data and building that trust is critically important over time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And actually, one question that's just come through, and it's not sort of been directed at anyone in particular, but maybe actually, Adam, if I come back to you quickly on this, because it was asked while you were talking, which is around, in the future, how might digital identities be affected by the potential rise in fake IDs and entirely fake people, which Christine just sort of mentioned, or fake organizations, via tech like deepfakes, which obviously we know has really sort of accelerated in prevalence over the last sort of 18 months or so. Any thoughts on that question from the audience?
Yeah, so we have to take into account that fake IDs exist now. I mean, this is a real current problem, as do what we would call FOGs, so fraudulently obtained genuine IDs. So these are real IDs that have just been obtained fraudulently. And they can exist in the system for many years and have a great impact, but they're quite expensive to get. But fake IDs exist. I mean, I can go to, there is a road in the Philippines called Recto. You can get pretty much any ID you like, US, UK, Filipino, doesn't matter. They'll make them within about half an hour, and just a guy on a bike turns up and gives it to you. These things just exist. The way you get over that is by building security into the identity system and the issuance process. And so deepfakes would be a problem if we allowed, as we are doing now, speaking entirely digitally, for people to initially register with an identity system that way, because it would be very difficult to determine whether this is a live Adam or a deepfake. So usually there is an in-person element, for example, that easily defeats that kind of problem for a deepfake. There is a possibility that that could affect authentications if you're using facial recognition, for example, because if you're doing that through a mobile phone, that could be a problem. But we need to build other precautions into, and other security techniques into how these things are used. So it's not just, does it look like Adam biometrically? It's where is he? Is he using the same device he would do normally? Is he in the same country even? Is he accessing services he would normally access? In fact, many of the things that the financial services organizations, much like Visa, and Mathieu probably talked to this, do right now in looking at how identities are used, not just authenticated with. So there's much more to security than just, does it look like Adam? There's a huge amount of things that go on behind the scenes about how that identity is being used, for what, why, all these kind of things. But it will not go away. There will always be attempts to subvert this technology.
There always will, exactly. And it's how do we make sure we mitigate the risks? We are very quickly running out of time, so I'm going to ask one final question to each of the panelists. Thank you for your answers. It's gone super quickly from my perspective, at least. So Mathieu, maybe starting with you, I'd be really interested from my perspective to get a sense of what Visa, and what from your side as well, what we need to do to kind of scale or sort of distribute digital ID effectively, and what are the changes that need to be adopted to ensure that we're really improving financial inclusion here in the UK? Yeah,
so I think, Christine, you mentioned some of that. It's true that, it's a network dilemma, so it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation where you need to work on both the issuing side and the acceptance side, and of course the security, which Adam mentioned on. So I think we tend to overlook a bit the acceptance side, and typically making sure that, because we've seen in the past, a lot of sometimes government led initiative specific to one use case. And then with one use case, it's hard to just get the adoption. And so I would encourage really to focus on the acceptance, which is often a bit costly and will take time. But in order to do that, you need to make sure that your solution can cater to multiple needs. And I think that's also, and equally the challenge would be your needs don't always need, Adam, you alluded to it, the super high level of trust. Some needs are catered differently. If you just need ID proofing and documentation verification, you can get that without necessarily a full digital identity network or government issued digital identity credential. So I think thinking about this acceptance would be good. and connecting the dots between different players will be also quite important. I think it's also, I think one dimension, it's probably easier to scale a digital identity if there is a commercial model attached to it. And when something, especially if you need the private parties to be part of the solution and to contribute to making it secure and safe and evolve over time and relevant for the parties, I think that having a commercial model is important. And if you look at the UK government or the EU Commission in their recent work, they have space for a commercial model. So it's not meant to be just this, publicly financed solution that we will necessarily maintain forever. I think having this commercial, sustainable, commercially sustainable model is an important dimension.
Thank you, Mathieu. Adam, maybe final question for you. What sort of digital identity policy changes do you think need to be adopted here in the UK to move from kind of using, from having access to digital identity to actually improving the usability of digital identity? How do we make that change?
I have to be slightly careful because I'm involved in some of the conversations with DCMS. However, from my point of view, I think a lot of this is around making digital identity as ubiquitous as possible. So making it much like my credit card. We've talked about credit cards a lot. I can walk into any store and use my MasterCard. Sorry about that, Mathieu. Wherever a Visa is also accepted, or an American Express. So there's interoperability there already. And I think that's very important. At the moment, what we have in the UK with Verify and other things they work in their own little clique, if you like, of services. I can't use them anywhere else. Another example of this in the UK is I've got an identity with the NHS, which allows me to show you my proof of the fact that I've had 2 vaccinations, etc., which is quite a high level of trust identity as well. But I can't use it anywhere else but in the NHS. So government, I think, has a responsibility to break down those silos and to encourage interoperability with the private sector as well, which also means government opening up the data it has to the private sector, which it's done very, very tentatively in the past, because they do have the passport data, the driving license data, all these other different things. They know all about our working history and things like that. That's very powerful when I'm trying to prove who I am. So government has a responsibility to empower me as a citizen to use my data to get a digital credential and create that interoperability.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Adam. And I couldn't agree more. That's definitely one of our key recommendations in techUK's digital identity white paper produced last year. So yes, very, very reticent of that recommendation. Christine, final word is to you then. What, from your perspective, what sort of digital identity policy changes would you like to see adopted in the UK to improve financial inclusion?
I think, again, got to be careful about what I say. We're working with DCMS on some of this also. I think it's the aspects of creating value. The most important thing to think about adoption and getting it to be ubiquitous, as Adam quite rightly said, is that the identity has got to be useful to individual. So across public private sector, we've got to be able to see value in it, use it, and that's got to be accepted everywhere. If it's not accepted everywhere, and useful, and to the point of appropriateness, that we can't be asked to get through tons of hoops to get it when we only need to, be able to say buy a pint in a pub. So that aspect of how many levels of pain do you go through in order to use it is critical in terms of adoption and getting it out there. Maybe it's enabling some transactions that we do every single day, so that it's easy to use to start off with, and then things that are greater requires greater level of assurance. Then there are more hoops to jump through. But having a sort of a somewhat scaled approach around appropriateness is critical, and encourage the private sector sector to adopt it, because there's got to be a value to them, and think through what's in it for them to be adopting the capabilities.
Fantastic. Brilliant finisher there, Christine. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for now. So I would just like to say a huge thank you to my panelists, to Adam, to Christine, to Mathieu for your brilliant contributions and sharing your expertise, and of course to the questions we've also received in the chat. I think this is very much the start of a conversation that we will be continuing through our engagements with DCMS and GDS over the next few months and years. But for now, I'd like to say a huge thank you to you all.